Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Federal funding and independent universities have long worked together to drive American innovation. But with support becoming less predictable, universities say the strain is showing in both research activity and the talent pipeline. Joining me to explain the impact on future discoveries is the president of MIT, Dr. Sally Kornbluth. Dr. Kornbluth, I know you have a very busy schedule, so thank you so much for joining me today.
Happy to be here.
You are on a campaign to make the case that the U.S. research system, which is federal funding plus independent universities, is really a national asset. From your perspective there at MIT, what is it about that system that makes it work so well?
Well, you know, research in this country is really done in three places: universities, national labs, and industry. And the reason that the partnership between the federal government and universities has worked so well is that universities tackle problems that take long-term commitment, protected from short-term pressures of politics and profits. And basically, it allows very basic, fundamental, curiosity-driven research to be done in a way that allows us to simply understand how things work. Now, the reason that's important is that the discoveries that lead to improvements in everyday life that we enjoy, whether it be medical treatments or communications networks or new technologies, all of these things began with very basic research in universities with scientists trying to understand the world around them. Now, you know, industry does a lot for this country in terms of, you know, bringing discoveries to market. We partner with industry quite a lot, but they don't have the time or the patience for the long road that it takes to bring things to fruition. And, you know, there are no shareholders that are willing to wait, 30 years for returns on their investment. And so the investment the federal government makes in this sort of research is necessary for the long-term prosperity of the nation.
And where are you seeing the system under most pressure right now?
Well, you know, one of the most worrisome things is that we've seen about a 20% cut in the federal research dollars that we're receiving. And this is true at many, many, many institutions across the country. And so our concern is that this will simply mean, first of all, that we will do less research. And second of all, that we will have fewer graduate students, fewer people who will be the scientific leaders of the future, because the way that graduate education is supported in this country is through federal research dollars that are used to train these individuals to be the kind of researchers that can move the ball down the field in the future.
Are you seeing this kind of pressure across the disciplines, or is it focused in certain areas? I mean, we hear a lot from this administration about their focus on health science, but are you seeing it in computing, agriculture, engineering, across the board?
You know, we can't figure out what the pattern is really. Now, obviously, there are areas that we've seen in, places that MIT does not have. Like, for instance, schools of public health are suffering all over the country because of cuts, for instance, to USAID dollars going away. Medical schools are seeing, particular areas of health research that are in danger. But what we're seeing is cuts in all sorts of areas, whether it be chemistry or physics or biology. And, I've met some scientists here at MIT who say in peer review, they've gotten the best scores of their lives. That means when their grants have gone for competitive peer review, they've gotten wonderful scores and they're still not seeing any money. So we can't figure out why those dollars are not flowing.
You mentioned also your concern about the talent pipeline. Talk to me a little bit more about the balance between U.S. students, international students, and what you're seeing on the ground right now.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a decrease in our graduate applications in many arenas, and we're accepting fewer graduate students because of the need to support them on federal grants. But international graduate students are a particular area of concern. So, look, we want to support domestic students, domestic education, but we also want to take the best talent in the world from wherever it comes. And I will say the U.S. has benefited enormously from this. When I look at our international students that come to MIT, the majority of them stay in this country. They build their careers here. They build their lives here. They have contributed enormously to the economic success of this country. And what we're seeing now is students, for instance, from China, they have fantastic opportunities in China now. China is pouring money into research. They are supporting the next generation of scientists. So a student who might otherwise have come to MIT will think, where is my future going to be? The other thing we're concerned about when it comes to international students has to do with visas. So, there's suggestions that visas should be much shorter. And, as I said, curiosity-driven research takes time. And I wouldn't come to the US if I felt that my research might be cut off midstream, either because my visa expires and I have to go back, or because the funding stream has been terminated, which is also being discussed. We talk about termination of research because it doesn't yield anything. Well, you know what? It takes such a long time. You have to be patient.
Dr. Kornbluth, you've also taken a very public position on these issues from the MIT chair. How did you think about that decision for MIT and what implications it might have for the broader university?
It's interesting. MIT, I'd say, more than any place I can think of, has been based primarily on merit. People come from all over the world. The science has been funded based on MIT scientists being competitive and getting awards based on merit. And so to us, that is a bedrock value that we can't compromise. I mean, even if we look in the student realm, this is maybe a little bit off topic, but we give free tuition to any family that earns under $200,000 because we want students to be able to come to MIT regardless of their background, regardless of their means, if they have the talent. And I just felt that MIT is representative of several things in this country. One is opportunity, no matter where you come from. The other is this hands-on ethos where students come here and they learn not just to think about things, they learn to build things, to make things for the future of this country. And so, for me, this is not an emotional issue, it's a factual issue. MIT is incredibly important for this country and for the economy. And so there's never been any question that we have to speak up for these principles.
And I want to come back to the policy influence question. You talked earlier about not being able to spot a pattern in how the administration has tackled these kind of science grants. Are you concerned and are you seeing evidence of policy influence in the direction of scientific research?
We haven't seen that at MIT. Again, we tend to focus so much on hard science, so it would be a little difficult to see that here. But it does concern me that there is conversation about having a tier of research above, if you will, merit-based scientific peer review, a tier of judgment as to which funds should be released. And, that's of concern because the system isn't perfect. No system is perfect. But by and large, this country has thrived through peer review based on scientific excellence. And so I'm concerned about, things that would be interposed between that and the conduct of science.
And as you watch this and as you think forward and the political pendulum swings every 2 to 4 years, are there policies or even legislation that you want to advocate for that might help stabilize the scientific research community?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things. One has to do with, this is always a little bit esoteric when people talk about things like indirect costs. And what we actually mean is the costs that are necessary to do the research, but they're not specific to a single project. And, my examples at MIT are things like running our nuclear reactor or running our nanofabrication facility or all sorts of, at any university, keeping the lights on. That is the kind of thing that needs to be stabilized. And there's been a lot of discussion about that. Now, we have some particular problems that are not the case for every university. So, we're facing a large endowment tax. And we use our endowment in two ways. One is to match dollars that come in from the federal government to support our research opportunity. And the other is to give robust financial aid to students. So if I look at going forward, to have a place like MIT have an 8% tax on gains is injurious. We're not just socking away money. We're using that money for research and for student education. And so, I'm hoping that if the pendulum swings, we will get some relief there.
And as you're thinking about the steady state or the pendulum swinging on support and funding, the kind of research that MIT does, this long-term scientific research, if it is interrupted or stopped, what does it take to get it started again?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I've seen it at MIT and I've seen it at peer institutions, long-term promising lines of research. When it gets interrupted, two things happen. One is there's a lot of technical issues with, if you will, powering back up again. But the other thing is you lose your trained talent. If you can't pay people to work in your laboratories, you lose people and you have to start at ground zero again with training people from scratch. That's incredibly concerning. I think where I see in a scary way that I think a lot of people can resonate with is if you're a patient in a clinical trial and those trials run out of money, you can lose access to those treatments. We have very high-tech facilities that, you don't just, I mentioned a nuclear reactor, you don't just power it down and power it up again by like flicking a switch. There are just a lot of things that require sustained effort. And if they're interrupted, we're not just losing the time of the interruption, we're losing a long time to restart the work and get it up and running again.
Dr. Sally Kornbluth is the president of Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Kornbluth, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you so much. And one last plug. We have a website called curiositymission.org. And for people who want to understand how curiosity-driven research fuels this country's success, please have a look.
Thanks so much. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.